Hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. My name is Brittany. Thank you so much for being here. Today I have a new episode in my Planet Zoo series for my Grassland Grove Zoo. This episode is a little bit of a long one because I'm not just going to be building a new habitat, I'm also going to be adding in another cafeteria area for guests in the south area of Savannah Dome, which is also where I'm building the new habitat. The animal that this habitat is for is the meerkat. They are one of my favorite animals to see at a zoo. I never miss out on seeing them if they're at a zoo. I think they're such cute little critters and so entertaining to watch. So I've been waiting for a good place to put them into my zoo. And I think this is it. Now, what you've been seeing me build in the background is not actually the meerkat habitat or the new cafeteria area. It is what will become a second viewing area of Savannah Dome. However, it is not finished, and while I could put it into a future zoo improvements video, since it's connected to the meerkat habitat and the new cafeteria, I figured that I'd just pop it into this video because you're going to see it quite a lot as I'm working on the other builds. It's a very simple building. For now, it's an L-shaped layout. However, I'm thinking that I'm going to add another habitat next to it, and I'll turn it into a Z shape instead, so that there's a second viewing area for the other habitat. I used the wooden plank wall type because I wanted to use a light wood tone, and I haven't used the wooden plank wall in a while. And then I just used the dark wooden columns as accents to finish off the build for the doorways and the edges of the barrier. At the moment, it's a very simple design, but I actually think that it complements what I've done with the meerkat habitat and the cafeteria quite nicely, because there's a little bit more to those builds. So the simplicity of this build kind of complements it nicely. But I guess we'll see how it flows when I finally finish it in a future video. I actually have no idea how it's going to turn out because as of recording this, it's still not complete. Okay, now I am getting started on the meerkat habitat, and I of course kick things off by building a giant rock wall. I really just wanted to continue on with the vibes of the Nyala and Nile Lechwe's habitats and how I did the barriers for them, but then to shake things up and make it look a little bit different, I added in the wooden log barrier at the front. I do change that a little bit later in the video into an actual wall piece, so it's not just the plain barrier. Going into this habitat, I actually had a really solid idea of how I wanted the main building part to look, or at least the roof part of it. I wanted this massive glass ceiling to kind of pop out of the rock walls on either side so that it kind of had this dome effect. It took me a little while to get the walls to line up properly because the distance of the roof didn't quite meet the rock wall that I'd already built for the Nile Lechwe's habitat. So I had to duplicate the rock wall and move the rocks a little bit closer so that they sat directly underneath the roof piece. I duplicated some more rocks to fill in the gaps between the Nile Lechwe's barrier and the meerkat's barrier, and the rest of the roof was super easy. Once it was done, I temporarily moved it off the top of the enclosure so that it would be nice and easy to see what I'm doing underneath. Guests are able to enter the enclosure with meerkats, so that's definitely something that I wanted to include here, but I did have a little bit of difficulty with the guest gate not wanting to line up properly with the path. This meant that I had to do quite a lot of fiddling around with the pathing, and in the end I kind of gave up on plan A, which was to have the guest gate flush with the path, and instead had to build out this mini guest entrance area where they can then access the guest gate. And I mean, I personally think that it probably ended up looking nicer than it would have if I just had the guest gate be flush against the path. The pathing system did of course still give me some frustrations, as you're seeing me play around and delete and re-add pathing so that it connects up nicely to the main path, but I got there in the end and now it looks super nice. I turned that one barrier into a one-way glass so that guests can see the meerkats as they enter before they go through the guest gate. It lets them choose whether they want to go through the guest gate or if they're just happy with the view that they got. I added in a tiny watering hole for the meerkats to drink out of. It really is tiny because they can't swim at all and there's no need for more water in their environment. And then once the animals were in the habitat, I got to work on making sure it was the perfect place for them. I had a lot of work to do with the heavy terrain paint because there was way too much grass, and meerkats love sand, obviously, they're burrowing creatures. So I added in heaps of sand and dirt and completely removed all traces of grass. Then I went through and added in some decorative rocks around the place. I started by adding some around the watering hole to hopefully allow them more access, and then built out the pathing system for the guests to walk around the habitat. I didn't want the path to extend the entire way around the habitat, so it's basically a circle placed in the very center so that they can have this great view, but also so that the meerkats have places to hide and don't get overwhelmed. I tried to include a couple of the burrowing habitats, which I've never used before. I'm not sure if it's because of where I was placing the little burrowing holes, but it seems like the meerkats are having a little bit of difficulty accessing them. They show up as inaccessible on the animal accessibility heat map, so if anyone has some suggestions on how to get them to work properly, please let me know below. Anyway, I added in a couple of the burrowing holes around the habitat, and then I also included the normal hay, just in case it's what the meerkats prefer. I added in a few more decorative rocks and then scattered some plants around the place. Meerkats don't like that much coverage, and given that there's very little water in this habitat, it didn't feel realistic to add in heaps of plants. So I added in some bushes and grass-like plants, but for all of the plants, I chose the option where they're just absolutely parched, so they look dry and dead to add a little bit more character into the habitat. The only live plants that I added in were the ones next to the water, because realistically those are the only plants that are actually getting enough hydration. I did include a couple of trees, but again they're the ones that look quite dry and like they'd survive in a desert. I tried to add in as many enrichment items for the meerkats as I could, but my vet research hasn't unlocked that many, so there were really only 3 for me to choose between, and only one of them was a toy enrichment item. And this means that their enrichment isn't perfect, but my vets have since done a bunch of research and unlocked the rest of the enrichment items, and I've gone back and added them in. Once that was done, I re-added the roof back on top and added in some finishing touches before I moved on to the food court area that I'm going to be building as well. The finishing touches were really just these light wooden columns to add some edges onto the glass dome. I went with light instead of dark for this part because I've used a lot of dark recently, and I really wanted this habitat to feel quite dry and deserty, and the dark columns are quite rich. I didn't want to use anything with warmth. This is where I switched the wooden log barrier at the front of the habitat to be wall pieces instead, so that the front was one closed off giant building, and then the back is open air. The wall pieces I used were the light wood as a continuation on from the oh dear section, with some glass at the very top to let in as much light as possible from all sides. If this habitat existed in real life, they would have to have an awfully good cooling system because it would be incredibly hot in there. For the archways, I did still use the dark wooden columns as they blended a little bit more closely to the wood log barrier that's on the inside of the habitat. I'm now adding in some educational resources for the meerkats. So I added in a speaker in the center of the room, and then for the habitat education boards, I wanted them to be placed on rock faces but not too high. So I custom built some new ones using 2 types of rocks, stacking a couple on top of each other. I also changed the barriers at the very front next to the guest gate from wooden logs to one-way glass so that guests had a completely unobstructed view of the meerkats. For the back wall of the habitat, there is a little bit of empty space. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to add another educational resource there or some kind of custom art piece. I played around with a couple of the art pieces, but ended up going with another educational resource on a 4x2 screen. So this is the sparing versus sharing educational poster. Of course, I had to go through and add in my very favorite wooden frame around the screen, and then I placed a couple of benches underneath it for guests to rest on and get their energy back up, and then a couple of bins, and then this is where I decided to switch some of the solid wood wall pieces to be windows instead, so that guests could have a view inside even if they don't go into the building. I used the 1 meter high wall piece along the bottom and top, added in the 4x2 one-way wall piece, realized that it wasn't high enough, so I had to duplicate the 1 meter wall piece at the top down by 1 so that the wall was fully closed off and the window was sealed. Once the windows were in, I added in some benches underneath so that guests could come and sit and view out the window if they chose to. I know that this is a game and that's not how it works, but in a real zoo, these seats would be prime real estate. And with that, the meerkat enclosure is officially finished and I'm moving on to the food court area for the guests. I ran into quite a lot of difficulty trying to figure out how I wanted to lay it out and also how I was going to connect all of the roofs together, because there's essentially 3 different zones and 3 different buildings that don't line up perfectly. But I started by duplicating the pathing from the second Savannah Dome viewing gallery because this lined up really nicely. And then I added in 2 food stalls and 2 drink stalls so that they were backed against the main pathway that leads into the viewing gallery. I did try pretty extensively to connect the food court path with the main path right next to the meerkat habitat, just so that guests had 2 ways in and out, but the path was just absolutely not playing ball, and I did actually cut out a huge chunk of me trying to make this work. I added in a couple of toilet blocks opposite to the food court and then used the light wooden walls to map out the shape of the building, which helped me start to visualize how it was going to look. There was a giant hole next to the staircase on the main path, which I don't know, felt like a massive safety concern to me. So I added in a whole bunch of big boulders to fill it in because there was just no way that the terrain was going to play ball with me between having a barrier on one side and the path on the other. And I quite like the look of the rocks. It adds some additional texture onto the ground. I added a couple of benches into the food court for guests to eat at. And because the staff area sits so close to the food court, there is one little section where negative impact of the staff buildings creeps onto the food court. So I blocked these off by using the big plaster blocks in this charcoal grey color, which looks very boring until I used some of the child education resources. And I actually love how they look here. I think they add in some much needed color into this area. And I mean, it's practical too. Mum and dad are eating, the kid's done, he wants to run around, and the educational resource is a distraction for them. And then against the wall, I just added in some more educational resources that I framed with the dark wooden columns. And these posters were global warming, ecotourism, and the bee decline, so it should be very interesting for the guests. I added in a few more bins around the place. I do just really hate when the guests leave their rubbish everywhere. And then finished off the front facade of each of the shops. I kept it really basic using the same light wood wall pieces, and then popped the sign for each shop above the windows and added a standing sign next to each of the windows, kind of acting as a barrier for the lines. Then I really had to start thinking about how I was going to roof this beast. I extended the pathway to the left so that the food court area would be one giant block, which would make it a lot easier for me to roof. At this point, there's nothing there. It's really just some glass that looks out onto a field of nothing. But in a future video, I think the next video that I'm going to put out, you will see what I do with it, and I think that it's a good use of the space actually. I used the dark wooden columns to fill in any gaps around the place, and then roofed the building using metal clad roof pieces. This does change because roof pieces are not very adjustable, and since this building doesn't line up perfectly with the meerkat enclosure, I really needed pieces that were going to be adjustable. I thought about doing the roof in 2 sections, one that covers the food court area and then one that extends from the meerkat enclosure, and then they would meet in the middle, but I didn't like how this looked, so then I deleted the meerkat enclosure one and was going to play around with how I could use wooden beams as the connector between the 2 buildings. But I very quickly realized how much work this was going to be, and I really didn't think that it was going to visually be worth the effort, so I pivoted to a new idea. I deleted everything I'd already done and instead used the flat plaster pieces in a dark charcoal grey color to roof the main food court area and connect it to the meerkat enclosure. This worked way better because it meant that I could very easily curve the pieces so that they angled up as they went to the meerkat enclosure. It also meant that I could individually rotate the pieces against the meerkat enclosure so that they sat completely flush instead of poking through like the standard roofing pieces did. I extended the roof all the way out to the staircase along the main path, and then to soften the amount of hard edges, I wanted to have this curved piece or well-angled piece from the main path to the food court building roof. I added in a whole bunch of columns underneath the roof along the main pathway because logically a roof of this size would be quite heavy and would need some extra support in the middle, but also it just looks really nice. This left a massive garden area in between the main path and the food court, which I do turn into a garden shortly. But in a zoo, if you don't have areas fenced off, guests are going to think that these areas are accessible to them. And I mean in a real zoo, not in Planet Zoo. But for realism purposes, I decided to add in some fencing just to ensure that this open area that will be a garden is not accessible to the guests. I did some tweaking with how the columns were placed so that they finished at a pole in the fence rather than just randomly in the middle of a fence. And then I turned that big open space into a desert-inspired garden. So just like in the meerkat habitat, I used a bunch of dry, dead bushes because there's no water in this area, and realistically, most of the plants are going to be dead, even if they are designed to survive the desert. I did add in one big tree that is designed to survive in the desert, and it was such a large space, it was kind of perfect for a tree. But the rest of the plants that I used were dry, dead, to match the aesthetic. I added in some more fencing to make sure that the garden was fully fenced in, and then I lined the roof pieces with the dark wooden columns, just to add in some visual difference to the grey roof and to hide any gaps or oddities in the roof pieces. And that is basically everything that I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, especially if you've made it all this way through. My next video is going to be something that I haven't added yet into the zoo, or well, you haven't seen me add into the zoo before, and makes an absolutely massive difference to my guests. Once again, thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one, and have a lovely rest of your day. Bye!